Hi, my name's Dan Keane. Welcome back to the channel. Apologies if I look a little bit sort of flushed out today. It's a very warm day outside. It must be at least 35 degrees in the studio, in addition to having some pretty warm softboxes on me as well. So apologies for that. But today I'm going to be talking about the Mac Mini, a computer that I've had for about a month, I think just over a month now. The reason I was sort of a little bit slow to post my first impressions is because every year Apple has a worldwide developers conference, the WWDC, and this year there were rumours that maybe there was going to be a new iMac. There wasn't a new iMac, or at least there hasn't been at the point of filming this video, but we did hear that they're going to be moving away from Intel-based chips and more to Apple's own chips. And if you've got an iPhone or an iPad and you've seen the power that they can produce by sort of designing their own architecture, it gives us a little bit of a preview into what we can expect with the Macs in the coming years. Now, they say that there will be a new Mac with this architecture coming later this year, but that overall there's going to be about a 2-year transition. So I don't feel too bad about still owning this Intel-based Mac. You know, the new, late 2019 Mac Pro is an absolute machine. And so today I thought I would just talk about the Mac Mini and what I think of it as a piece of hardware to be used for music production in 2020. So just a little bit of context. This is the computer I had before it. It's a 2015 15-inch Apple MacBook Pro. This has a 2.5 gigahertz Core Duo Intel Core i7 processor, 16 gigabytes of RAM, 500 gigs of storage, and has the upgraded graphics chip. Now, this has been an absolute workhorse. I'm really pleased with it. Definitely the best investment I've made over the last 5 years, and it's seen me all the way through undergrad and then through postgrad as well. Now, if I weren't in the business of doing more kind of commercial projects I'm excited to share with you soon, I might not need to upgrade my system. I think as I finished music college, came out, decided I wanted something a little bit more sort of professional, a little bit more kind of desktop quality, that I would opt for another computer. Now, when I sort of think about the various options I have, some people saying, you know, do you want Windows, do you want Mac? Really, I'm shackled down to the Apple ecosystem, namely because I use Logic, and Logic is an Apple-only software. So when it came to deciding on which computer I was going to buy, you know, really you're just looking at the various options. You've got the iMac Pro, the Mac Pro, and then the Mac Mini. And I believe there is a small but very powerful cult following of the Mac Mini who have followed it ever since it first came out. And I was not one of those people. But if you look at the price, it's actually the most sort of competitively priced product. And the reason for that is because all you get is the box itself. You don't get a screen, you don't get a keyboard and mouse. But the reason that I bought this computer is because I already have those things. So if I'm going to invest some money in a computer, I may as well invest in upgrading the RAM, upgrading the CPU, things like that. So what I've got on my configuration is a 3.2 gigahertz 6-core processor. This is an Intel Core i7 processor. Now, I also opted for 64 gigabytes of RAM, but I didn't buy it with 64 gigabytes of RAM installed. I bought the base model, so that cost about $1,200. Now, in comparison to my MacBook Pro, this was about $2,000 when I bought it 5 years ago. So you can see that the difference in price there is really quite severe. And again, this was only a dual-core processor, whereas the one I'm running on now is a 6-core processor. For those of you who don't know, and to be honest, I'm one of those people as well, from what I've heard, the way sort of multiple cores work is that, you know, if it can spread the tasks across many of those cores, it's less likely to throttle performance or require extensive fan use, things that do become a bit of an issue for us people recording audio. Now, I decided to buy the crucial 64 gigabyte kit online because it's so much cheaper than buying it through Apple's website. If you go to Apple's website, the upgrade from 8 to 64 gigabytes of RAM is $1,000, but I picked up this kit for $300, and then the cost of the extra screwdrivers you need is about $35, if that. And for what takes 20 minutes and 17 screws, I mean, it is something that you've got to detach several elements. It's not as easy as maybe some older computers where you could literally just sort of open the RAM slots and pull them out. It is a little bit more invasive than that. But unless you're really worried about going into your computer, and I do understand because it is an expensive computer to destroy, potentially, I would really recommend doing the RAM upgrade yourself. So for my use case, I run a lot of sort of high intensity sample libraries. I like having pieces that have quite complicated arrangements to them, and I prefer to have a sort of an articulation per instance of whatever it is I'm using. So I might have the spiccatos and the short harmonics on separate tracks, whereas some people might have a short track with key switching. I've just never really got into key switching. So I'm going to be talking mainly about my use case, but of course it varies for you. And if you're doing more sort of production-based stuff with audio, you're processing a lot of things in Pro Tools or something like that, I maybe wouldn't suggest going for 64 gigabytes of RAM. Maybe just 8 or possibly 16 gigabytes of RAM would be best for you. Whereas if you're in the process of doing a lot more sort of higher end sample projects and things like that, then you're probably going to find that you need not only the multi-core CPU, but also a significant amount of RAM. Now on this Apple MacBook Pro, I had 2 USB-A ports, 2 Thunderbolt 2 ports, an HDMI port, and a headphone jack, also an SD card slot, but apparently we don't need those anymore. Now on the back of the Mac Mini, you've got many ports. You've got 2 USB-A ports, a headphone jack, HDMI port, 4 Thunderbolt 3/USB-C ports, and an Ethernet cable, and you can have this upgraded at checkout to 10 gigabit Ethernet. It's worth saying at this point that it's not possible for you to upgrade the Ethernet or the CPU externally. It's actually soldered into the motherboard. So if you wanted to have this done, you'd have to take it back to Apple and get that fitted. And I believe it's not actually that expensive in comparison to what the parts actually cost. But RAM is definitely user upgradable, although it's not advertised as such on their website. Now, somebody asked me about sort of what interface I use and whether or not the peripherals on this device have sort of set me back. I use a Focusrite Saffire Pro 40 interface, which when I first bought it was on my 13-inch 2010 MacBook Pro, which did actually have a firewire port. So it's a firewire interface. I then bought a firewire to Thunderbolt 2 connector to use with my MacBook Pro, and I've since had to invest in a USB-C or Thunderbolt 3 to Thunderbolt 2 adapter. So I've got many adapters in the chain, but it works perfectly fine. You're listening to the audio recorded through it now, and I think it works absolutely fine. Now, when it comes to streaming my samples, I don't have them internally on my computer unless it's something that I'm working on at the time. So I have a plethora of various hard drives that I stream from, but the main ones that I use for my samples are my Samsung T5 2TB drives. These are USB Type-C, they're incredibly fast, and they've done the job really well for me. I use 2 of these, one for my samples and the other as a sort of overflow car park of samples in addition to my YouTube films. Now it's worth saying that the Mac Mini doesn't have the greatest graphical performance, but because it's got all those USB-C ports, I could at a later stage invest in an eGPU by someone like Blackmagic. It's something I'll probably consider if I start shooting in 4K at a later stage, which I'm not currently. Now I'm sure a lot of people are going to be asking questions about the fan noise. It's so quiet actually that I actually have it on my desk, not even underneath, not in a separate room or anything like that. It's been absolutely fantastic. And as I mentioned, it's a very hot day today, and my MacBook Pro really would have the fans going berserk by now. So I'm really pleased to say that it's absolutely silent. Now it does run pretty hot, and so the fan only goes on when it absolutely needs it, and it is just a single fan, so you're not able to get that sort of slight cancelling out that the Mac Pro has now with 3 fans. But overall, I found it to be really powerful. And so when the fans might kick up because you're doing something intensive like noise reduction, or you might be in a really intensive session, if it comes to be that you don't need that anymore and you quit the app, within about 40 seconds, the fans are back down to silent again. So really not an issue at all. Now, I asked you guys on Twitter and YouTube to submit any questions you might have about this machine, and I'm quite happy to answer them now. I hope I've answered a few of them already, but let's just go through a few. Nicholas asks, what limits did you encounter with your MacBook Pro? Was it limited by CPU speed and thermals, RAM speed and size, or general old machine fatigue, if that's a thing? So what I'd say to that is the MacBook Pro has been absolutely fantastic, and the only reason I've really had to upgrade is because I've reached a ceiling point on the amount of RAM that I can get. With this machine, I was only able to get up to 16 gigabytes, and that's been fine, and it is fine if you're running sort of smaller sessions and things. But once you start sort of mounting things on top of each other, you've maybe got Pro Tools running in the background with a film, you've maybe got screen recording as well. For YouTube, if nothing else, it just needed more RAM, more processing power. But again, this is a great machine, and I will still take this on trains with me, and I will still do lots of remote recording using this rig, so really no qualms at all. Ewan Smith says, my 2014 Mac Mini has great I/O and a top spec RAM and SSD, but my question would be, how is the noise of the fan? Sometimes mine is picked up by mics. How could it be made quieter for the more demanding audio tasks? Well, as I say, my fan has actually been incredibly quiet. I'd recommend, if you are sort of struggling with noise, you're in a small room, things like that, obviously if you can distance the computer from the microphones as much as possible, then that obviously helps. But also, whenever you're recording something, you know, if you've got a cardioid mic, I always try and position it not only as far away as possible, but actually physically pointing in the opposite direction to the computer. That's definitely going to help. And when I record strings, I tend to go as far over there as I can. Something I was particularly excited about when recording my new BLM piano toolkit, I mean, it's not ready yet, but it will be ready quite soon, was that I could actually have it right next to the piano while I was recording, and the fans didn't flare up once in the 1,000+ samples that I recorded. Have I said too much? Billy Palmer asks, how much of a step up from the MacBook Pro 2015 do you feel the Mini is, and do you split your workflow between the two devices? Now, Billy, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you have a 2015 MacBook Pro. I would say for you, it depends where you're at in terms of your production game. I'd say it is a pretty significant step up. I guess it's like moving from a really old hatchback to a brand new supercar. You know, there are things you've come to love about your old hatchback, but, you know, the supercar will get you from A to B a lot more quickly. In terms of dividing the workflow, really, I'm only going to be using this now when I go out on the road. Again, if you could choose to drive your hatchback to work or your supercar, you'd probably take the supercar, wouldn't you? Finally, I've got a question here from @CHenson who says, how is it with the BBC template? Well, it works really, really well with the Spitfire Audio BBC SO. And if I were to write a piece of music of, say, 10,000 notes across 3 minutes, which is what my Incredibles rescore was, linked down below, for my MacBook Pro, I'd have to max out the I/O buffer size in order for me to play that, and often it wouldn't actually play the whole way through without stopping for system overload. In comparison, I can run that on my Mac Mini with processing as well at a buffer size of about 128 samples. So the difference there is quite significant, and more than anything, if you can up your I/O buffer size, you're going to have more headroom. So I'm really excited to see that it should last me at least 5, if not 10 years, hopefully. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you found it to be useful, or at least entertaining, to watch me sweat under this hot light. But subscribe if you haven't done already. I've got so many exciting videos to come. Join my Patreon down below if you haven't seen already. Lots of exclusive content on there, and I will see you all in the next video.